Many of you probably realize by now that the Hornet actually recovered Apollo 11 and Apollo 12 in 1969, and also we recovered an unmanned Apollo flight in 1966. And so the exhibits that we're building are specifically focused on telling the story. So when you see the helicopters downstairs, those were the types of helicopters used in manned spacecraft recovery. That capsule that you see downstairs, it is the flown capsule, flew in 1966. It was part of a mission called AS-202, and it was recovered by the Hornet off Wake Island, August 25th, 1966. And that was just loaned to us by the Smithsonian Institute. It's on a 10-year loan here. That mobile quarantine facility that you may have seen so far downstairs is a real one. It's not fake. It was used in the recovery of Apollo 14. There's only 2 mobile quarantine facilities in existence. We have one, the Smithsonian Institute has the other. So Alan Shepard, the guy who hit the golf ball on the moon, and Stuart Roosa and Edgar Mitchell are the people that stayed in that mobile quarantine facility for 3.5 days while they were being brought back to Pearl Harbor and flown back to the United States. So the thing that's missing in all that, of course, is the people. So let me set the stage for you. Let's take you back 35 years ago yesterday. 3 men in a golden chariot, if you will, rode a plume of flame and smoke into the sky. July 16th, 1969, 3 men went on their way to the moon. 4 days after that, which is 3 days from now, 2 of those 3 men descended to the lunar surface, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, and walked on the moon collecting some moon rocks. They spent, a few hours on the surface, if you will, and then came back, and several days after that, on July 24, 1969, they splashed down in the Pacific, a few hundred miles southwest of Hawaii. The Hornet was there to meet them, along with some pilots from Helicopter Squadron 4, Anti-Submarine Warfare Squadron 4, members of UDT, or Underwater Demolition Team 11, and a number of other aircraft, and of course a pool of radio and TV and other news media personnel. And so we will present to you today some of the people who were there. But first, what I'd like to do is introduce Mayor Beverly Johnson, the mayor of Alameda, who's been mayor now, I think, for a little over a year. And have her come and say some remarks about what we're trying to do here and what we've done with the good city of Alameda, who's a big supporter of the Hornet and of this festival. Mayor Johnson.
Thank you very much, and I'd like to welcome you all to the Hornet here in Alameda, and thank you for coming. The city of Alameda is very proud and has worked very hard to, initially when the Hornet became a museum, and keeping the naval history that was such an important part of Alameda since about 1939, when the nation was gearing up for World War II, and Alameda Naval Base was opened shortly after that. So having the Hornet here is one way that we can keep a very significant part of not only Alameda's history, but our nation's history alive. And I'm so pleased with the direction that the Hornet is going. I was at the Smithsonian and saw, some of the flight equipment that they have, and they have parts of spaceships and things like that, and they even have a part of an aircraft carrier. But we have the real thing here in Alameda. We have a real aircraft carrier, and the fact that the Hornet was part of the Doolittle mission is a very important part of history. And so I think it's so important to keep history alive, and this is really, really an important way to do that. I'd just like to say how honored we are to have the special guest and astronaut Dick Gordon, who's here today. It's truly a privilege to meet people like this who have done things that we can only kind of dream about and think, gee, did that really happen, or what would that really be like to do that? So many kids now, young kids, these things were taken for granted, but 35 years ago, we didn't have computers like we have now. We didn't have cell phones like we have now. Microwave ovens weren't there. We didn't have CDs. And my kids look at a record that you play on a record player, and they say, "What's that?" So we have to. This helps us put perspective on the real accomplishments that happened 35 years ago. that when you think back to the technology that was available to us as ordinary people, there was, sure, the space program had more, but it was pretty rudimentary compared to what we have now. And so the accomplishments are even more amazing when we think back to what was available to them back then when they actually did these space flights, and how risky it was going into space. I think, we see our shuttles going up and down and landing, and we kind of forget how risky it was back then. So I'd like to thank the Hornet and welcome you to this Splashdown event. This will be a place that Americans and people around the world can come and learn more about our space program. And I'm sure you've all seen the movie Apollo 13, but what an important part coming back to Earth is in the space flights. It's, we kind of minimize or trivialize that. The hard part is getting up there and then walking on the moon there, but the most important part, I think, is getting them home safely, and that's what the Hornet helped do. So thank you all for coming out, and enjoy the Splashdown events. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary Johnson. Very inspiring. I remember when I was a kid, I'll just tell you a little story. I grew up in Orlando, Florida, and I won't tell you the date, but you can probably figure out when I tell you that when the Mercury missions and the Gemini missions and eventually the Apollo missions were getting ready to launch, we'd sit there in school and we'd watch the countdown on this TV set, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And as soon as they said ignition and then liftoff, everybody in the school would race outside so that we could actually see the rocket taking off and going up, and these guys doing their magnificent things. I mean, flying suborbital missions to start with in '61, and then going on from there to flying around the Earth, John Glenn, and then eventually going to the moon. It's just unbelievable to be there. It was a very personal, moving experience for me. The interesting thing, of course, is that the journey, Apollo 11, was epic, not just for me or for the people in it. It's not just a seminal event for the United States of America. It was perhaps the greatest scientific achievement in all human history. All human history. And we've lived through that. We've experienced that. We've been part of it. So we're really pleased to be here in Alameda today to be able to bring this event to you. One other personal little note. Until two days ago, I'd never been in a radio station and on radio. So I figured I would go in there. I wasn't really intimidated. I'd been in the Marines. What the heck had happened, right? So we walk in there, and I sat down with that microphone staring at me, and let's see, Sean O'Keefe, the director of NASA, was on one of the telephone lines. Alan Bean, the fourth man to walk on the moon, was on another telephone line. Scott, I forget his last name, Gamble or somebody, was from the director of NASA Ames, was sitting on one side. And on my other side was this other fellow who had been in radio and TV for 25 years and made 25,000 radio broadcasts, and me. So I think I held my own, but right now I'd really like to introduce to you Don Blair, who was the radio voice of Apollo 11. He was on the Hornet, on the 06 level, when those three parachutes blossomed in July 24, 1969, and brought those first guys back from the moon. He was the voice you heard worldwide on radio, and he's gone on since then to actually write a book, the first book of its kind, called Splashdown, NASA and the Navy, and he's graciously agreed to be the MC, the official MC for the Splashdown Festival. Please join me in welcoming Don Blair.
Thank you, Bob. Mayor Johnson, astronaut Gordon, and helicopter pilot Higginson, and ladies and gentlemen. I know it's an old cliche, it's trite to say it's an honor to be here, but oh man, you have no idea. I'm standing here 35 years plus 1 day from the time I stood up on the 06 level and broadcast to the world the return of the Apollo 11 astronauts. I stood at that spot up by the semaphore station. I watched Richard Nixon descend from the White House helicopter. Actually, it was the Marine helicopter, but it was White House. I watched Secretary of State Bill Rogers walk across the deck, Henry Kissinger, who was then his Security Affairs advisor to Mr. Nixon. Some pretty big people. And one of the pictures I took from that level up there at 06, looking down at President Nixon shaking hands with Dr. Thomas Paine, the head of NASA, and Captain Carl Seiberlich, skipper of this great ship, who will be here next week, and I can't wait to see him again. One of the people in that picture was Admiral John McCain, SINCPAC, Commander-in-Chief Forces in the Pacific. At the time, he was there, and we had coffee in the Admiral's cabin and met the gentleman. I remember Admiral McCain, he's only a short man, and it seems to me, all of us, that he smoked cigars as tall as he was. He had these long Cuban cigars. What a wonderful, wonderful gentleman. But what I'm just trying to relay to you is the privilege that I have had, and then the honor of coming back here. And I'm not kidding when I tell you, for me, it's goose pimple time. A friend wrote a story about me in the Sarasota, Florida paper, and not far from where we live in Florida, just a week ago. And when we were sitting having lunch one day and he was making notes on this, what he was actually doing was giving me a very, very nice advance promo on the release of this book, which only came out 2 weeks ago. And he said at one point in his article, because it's what I said to him, when I was on these ships, I was like a kid in a candy store. I mean, it's an honor, it's a privilege. Most of the time in the news business, and Bob said 25 years, actually 25 years in network radio in New York, but this is my 50th year in the business. And I really, really haven't slowed down much, and I think the book is kind of evidence of that. But let me just give you a brief picture. I was going to say I'll try to be brief, and it won't be easy for me to be brief. I did 5 minutes when I was born, for heaven's sake. First thing I did was thank my mother and my father. I was born in the hospital because I wanted to be close to Mom, but that's another story. Anyway, this book and the timing on it, as Bob Fish will tell you, was ridiculously unintended. I started thinking about 2 years ago, after 5 or 6 years of lecturing about this subject on some of America's biggest cruise ships. My wife and I go out. It's a wonderful way to spend a week or 10 days. Every couple of days you give a lecture on Gemini, then Apollo, then the shuttle, then the space station. The interest was growing, the audiences were getting bigger on every cruise. People were coming up to me after the cruises. They'd see you in the cocktail lounges or in the theater and so forth and say, gosh, that was interesting. I had no idea. Well, that's the whole point. The world has no idea what went on here. And I said to Dick Gordon when I met Richard as he came aboard the ship earlier this morning, I said, you know, we reported on your epic events and your achievements, and you were America's new heroes, and totally deservedly so. And at the same time, a mighty arm of the United States military, the United States Navy, was quietly doing its job, getting a thank you here and there from a president or an admiral, and then going back to their regular assignments, anti-submarine warfare or whatever it might have been. Doing it quietly and without, you know, bowing and scraping and saying, oh, look what we did, look what we did. But what I saw in a period of about 7 years, from the Gemini missions I started on the USS Wasp, to here on the Hornet in 1969, and then my last mission aboard the Okinawa in 1971, Apollo 15, was an enormous pride and in total confidence, to the point where when Carl Seiberlich, the skipper of the Hornet, sent a beautiful letter to the families of his crew, he wasn't just piling on, you know, platitudes, and he really wasn't exaggerating when he told these families what a magnificent job their sons and husbands had done on this great ship. And he told me at the time, and I talked to him on the phone several times in the last couple of months prior to his coming out next week. I said, Carl, and can you imagine, I was a corporal in the Army and I'm calling it Admiral Carl. This is silly, but he won't let you call him Admiral. He says, no, it's Carl. I said, Carl, who determined how many rehearsals you folks did? I was going to say we, because I observed them, I flew on them. I could have gone on a helicopter every day. They would let you bring your cameras, go out, you're a reporter, you're chronicling history. And again, just the privilege of going up in a helicopter as piloted by John Higginson. He was photo helo on Apollo 11. But to be able to hang out in that doorway, looking over the head of the winch operators or the frogmen as they leap into the Pacific, 15, 20 feet with all this stuff on their backs, and then they inflate the rafts and everything else. I mean, it just started piling up. Like, look what I have been able to see, and look what I've been carrying around with me for the past 35 years. So about 2 years ago, I really started to get serious about putting it down on paper. I've got some marvelous pictures in that book that I would like you to look at and to see that have never been published before, including one of Neil Armstrong, the night he came back from the moon. We had all been on our feet since 4 that morning, and here it is 10 o'clock at night. I'm in the wardroom having a cup of coffee, and it's just so much nervous energy bottled up, we didn't even know we were exhausted after that long day. So I said, I'm going to take one more walk down to the hangar bay where the MQF was and see what's going on. I walked down the deck, and as I got closer to that trailer, not that one, but the other one that's at the Smithsonian, I could see an individual standing in the front room. I got closer and closer, and it was Neil Armstrong, the first man on the moon. He's standing there with a ukulele in his hand. So I took my lens, I guess about an 80mm, and I pushed the lens to obliterate the frame of the doorway there. I didn't want you to know that it came through a window. In the picture you'll see in the book, it just looks like I was in the living room with him. I never found out what he was playing, but I snapped off 3 quick shots. I turned and walked away, and Neil Armstrong had disappeared, probably back into the bunk area, as well he should have. But it's what we call a photo op, and I sent him a copy of it at the University of Cincinnati, so he's got it. And he was seen around the ship often after that with the uke, but that night I was the only one that got that particular picture. So there's some unique things in there. Another thing we are incredibly proud of. For the first time in hardcover, and if I'm looking out at Navy people, this is what we want really the writing and reading public to know. For the first time in hardcover, outside of a NASA document, we have a list of every single ship that sailed on a recovery mission. Of course, many of them were like, 20 and 25 ships down the list. Secondary, you might say, but by gosh, they were all trained and ready to do a recovery if they were in the ideal spot. And out of 31 missions, 27 carriers, like Hornet, did the actual recovery. But on 4 other occasions, the carriers weren't close enough, and destroyers had to do the job. And guess what? They were fully trained, and they did it perfectly. So the book, Splashdown, NASA and the Navy, is my bow and tip of the hat to the United States Navy. And again, people have said, and boy, do I love to hear it, it's about time somebody told this part of the story. So now you've heard it. If you don't buy the book, you will not be allowed to leave the ship. So. Anyway, that's what brought us here. And I was introduced to Bob Fish on the internet about a year ago. And it wasn't long after we started corresponding, and believe me, Bob Fish has contributed so mightily to this book. I was tempted to divide the royalties with him, but I gave it up today. Decided not to. But no, he has been absolutely wonderful. But way, way back, he said, do you realize what we're planning to do next July and what you're doing sitting there at your computer? He said, do you think we might meet on this deck on this week? You think your publisher can get the darn book ready? Well, there was some sweat time, I'll tell you. We wondered if it would make it, because we have a wonderful publisher who's got dozens of books in the works at all times, and some work had to be pushed aside so that Splashdown could come through. But it's here, and I just hope the Navy people that are in there that never saw their names or their pictures in hardcover or public print before, outside of a NASA, in the ship, I just hope they like what they see, because believe me, the thank yous from the nation are long overdue. So that's the story. That's what brought us here. And my thanks again to Bob, because he said, you got to be here, Blair. Your book is what it's all about. And take a look at the cover. It was painted by a great artist from south of here in California, Stan Stokes. And when Bob first sent it to me on the computer and said, take a look at this. Do you think this would work for your book? I said, my God, that is my book. It's the splashdown chutes coming down. It's the carrier, this carrier up in the corner, and helicopter number 66 in the lower right-hand corner. It's the whole thing. So it was just a perfect marriage of people, both heading in the same direction at the same time. And I'm just thrilled to be here. Thank you so much. It's been 35 years since I met this gentleman on my far left. But I realized right away when the name started coming up in the emails, yes, I know John Higginson, I know John Higginson. I opened my book, and the day that the Apollo 11 came home, we had a splashdown dinner. And I'm telling you, whatever they say about food in the military, forget about it. I mean, we had New England lobster, prime rib. The soup was to die for. The soup chef could have worked in any hotel in America. It was fabulous. And there was a menu. And after the dinner, I went around the room to people I had gotten to know, friends, pilots, frogmen, you name it. And John Higginson's autograph is on that menu from 35 years ago. And that's the last time I saw him. And now I meet him again, and he hasn't changed a bit. But he piloted photo helo, and I went out on so many of those helos. I probably flew with John, but I know I had coffee with him, and we small talked. You know, we were friends 35 years ago. We meet again, and now you meet him, helicopter pilot, Admiral John Higgins.
Very much, Don. That's the best introduction I've had today so far. I'm always a little cautious. I see a lot of faces out there. Some of them may be familiar. Are there any former Navy people out there? Raise your hand. Oh, look at them. Are there any Navy officers out there? What really counts, though, are there any Navy chiefs out there? Uh-oh, he's the guy that'll catch me. There's another one. Wonderful. Well, really glad to have you with us today because I've spent 34 years with you and your friends, your shipmates, and it's been a wonderful trip. I'm here today in a very humbling position because I guess I kind of represent the helicopter community, and I'm just proud and anxious to do that. By a sheer stroke of coincidence, I was in a squadron longer than any of the recovery pilots, so I ended up on 4 Apollo recovery missions in the same helicopter squadron. And I flew, I believe, on 3 or 4 of them as the photo helo guy. If you watch television on some of the recoveries, you saw it come from the back of my airplane. And as luck would have it, when I finished my tour with that squadron, I got transferred to a ship, more sea duty, and it was the next recovery ship, the USS Okinawa. So I've been the victim or whatever of NASA for 5 times. I know I told my kids that NASA doesn't stand for something like no Santa Claus, but I devoted 2 Christmases to NASA, so my kids knew what NASA stood for. In any event, it's a real pleasure to be with you today. I've got a little slideshow this afternoon that I'm anxious to show to anyone who's interested on how the recovery works from a helicopter's point of view. But the wonderful thing about the helicopter exposure to this aspect of science is that it pointed out what a helicopter can do. And there's nothing else that can do that job. You know, so an astronaut lands in the water, what do? Send a canoe or a powerboat or whatever? It doesn't work well that way. You've got to have a helicopter out there. The enhancement of safety and procedures is just beyond comparison. I spent most of my life in helicopters chasing submarines, and those guys are good. They're hard to catch. But it was a wonderful break for me to become part of this ship. I cruised on it at least several times before. I've got a couple of years of my life on Hornet, so it was a real homecoming to me. But it was an exciting time to be part of the space program and watch our nation lead the world in that effort. Thank you very
I don't have the rank these gentlemen have, but I have the privilege of introducing John. And now a gentleman whose descent from Earth orbit I watched and broadcast in September of 1966 aboard the helicopter carrier, they call them LPHs, the USS Guam. LPH stood for Landing Platform Helicopter. No more arresting cables, no fixed wing, just helicopters. And the ship was militarily designed to move Marines into combat situations real quick. Well, that is where I and, let's see, CBS's Terry Drinkwater, I don't know if you remember Terry, but He was one of Walter Cronkite's favorite. He was CBS Los Angeles. Terry and I sailed from Norfolk aboard the Guam in September of '66 to go and broadcast the splashdown of Gemini 11. The late Pete Conrad and our next guest, Dick Gordon, right here, and of course Apollo 12.
John, thank you for the introduction. Mayor Johnson, Bob, John, ladies and gentlemen, it's a real privilege for me to be here today. And I love these old gray ships. Some of the happiest days of my life were spent on which we call Round Bottom Air Station. And this is exactly what these ships are. You know, my first visit to the Hornet, I didn't get to see it. In November of 1969, somebody was afraid that we were going to bring back some exotic bug or whatever the medical profession professed. And my 4 days coming back from Western Samoa to Honolulu, to Pearl Harbor, where incidentally, I was met by Admiral McCain. Crew was when the ship pulled in, and of course his son at that time was in the Hanoi Hilton, not enjoying life very much, but that's a story in itself. But let me tell you that best days of my life, some of the best days of my life, were the 2 cruises that I made as a naval aviator on the Coral Sea to the Mediterranean, the 6th Fleet, and my last deployment was on the USS Ranger in 1962, and Mayor Johnson, it left from this very port. This was the home port for Ranger, and I was in a squadron of Miramar. We flew some of the airplanes up here and loaded them aboard, and some of them we had the privilege of flying on ship as she passed beyond the gates of Pearl Harbor, the Golden Gate Bridge. But those days were very, very exciting to me, and they've taken place prior to my involvement in the space program. The space age started on the 4th of October of 1957 when the Soviet Union launched Sputnik. Now here we have the ability to get into space, and guess what we humans do, and we have that ability, we go there. And we intended to do that because we now have the ability to do so. 7 young military test pilots were chosen in April of 1959. But this was the height of the Cold War. And it was a war. A lot of people may or may not realize it, but we were involved with our adversary, the Soviet Union, essentially for the hearts and minds of humankind. And we wanted to be the first ones into space. The Soviet Union had a head start, Sputnik. But before we could launch Alan Shepard in May of 1961, the Soviet Union did it again. On April 12th of 1961, a young Soviet pilot, his name was Yuri Gagarin, became the first human being in space. Well, from that moment on, we realized that we were in that race. I was a young test pilot, just graduated from school in 1957 in July, and when Sputnik was launched, a whole new avenue opened up for myself, and it was my desire to participate. I had that opportunity with selection in October of '63. I went to NASA, became a member of the backup crew for Gemini 8, flew on Gemini 11, as Don mentioned, and recovered on the Guam in September of 1966. I rotated then with the Apollo program. You remember Apollo and the auspicious start we had? It wasn't really very auspicious, was it? January of 1967, we lost the lives of 3 good friends, Gus Grissom and White. It took us a while to recover from that, but we did. And the Apollo program started with the flight of Apollo 8 in October of 1968. You know, our president's pretty smart. President Kennedy, when he proclaimed that we were going to go to the moon, land men there, and return them safely to Earth. You know, the best part of that whole sentence I like? Mayor Johnson, you said it. Safely to Earth. Well, we finally got going with the Apollo program, and I backup crew member of Apollo 9, which was the first flight of the lunar module in Earth orbit. Then I recycled to Apollo 12. It was the second lunar landing flight, flown in November of 1969 when I flew with a late Pete Conrad, a very, very close friend of mine, and Alan Bean. And we had one of the greatest experiences of our life, sharing that experience of going to the moon, landing there, but more importantly, to look back at our home planet. You put your fingers around it, it's about that big around. And they've often asked us what we discovered when we went to the moon. My response has always been, we discovered the Earth. And that's really what it's all about. I then recycled up to 12 and became the backup commander of Apollo 15. And later would have hopefully become the commander of Apollo 18. But guess where the mission stopped? Apollo 17. So I've got 60 miles to go. Anybody got any good ideas out there? How to fly that last 60 miles? But that was my career essentially in NASA. I spent 8 glorious years there from 63 to 72 when I retired in January.